Hi, I'm Jason Mefford, and you're in the right place to start transforming your career and life with this podcast. I've been in the trenches as an executive leader, and now I'm an executive coach and confidential advisor to executives all over the world. I use a multidisciplinary approach to improve learning that drives transformation by getting to the root cause in a practical, no-nonsense way. I love learning and sharing what makes people tick. You get both education and entertainment, since learning shouldn't be boring, right? But that's enough about me. This podcast is a combination of intuitive leadership, neural influence, and mental mastery to take your career and life to levels you've never thought possible. If you're wanting to improve yourself, develop stronger relationships professionally and personally, make quicker, better decisions, and become a more effective leader, then of course, this podcast is for you because you are going to learn how to manage emotions in yourself and others, avoid burnout, stress, and anxiety, master your mind, get people to listen and take action, and become a lifelong learner. And when you do that, you will have a positive mental attitude, executive leadership presence, and the skills to know exactly what to say and do in any situation. I'm glad you're here. So, let's get started. Hey everybody, I am talking to George Graves today, and George is actually kind of a blast from the past, if you will. We knew each other way back in the days when we were both at Arthur Andersen together, and then moved to KPMG. In fact, George was kind of one of my bosses back then. So, George, it's great. It's great to have you here. I'm excited to have you because I know you've had been about a 40-year career in public accounting. Just recently left KPMG, so I'm excited to have you here to reconnect, but also to kind of talk about a lot of the things that you've kind of seen over time and maybe some of the things people need to hear more about. So George, welcome.
Sure. Thanks, Jason. It's great to be here. It's just been a long, strange trip, as they say, in this thing. And starting out, at Andersen back in the early '80s, doing good old fashioned external auditing, but taking that wonderful computer science minor that I had in school, which involved a lot of programming and Fortran and COBOL and
Fortran and COBOL, those are words a lot of the younger people won't know what they are.
exactly, punch cards and getting them out of order and all that stuff. But taking that foundation, ultimately, then moving down the path at Arthur Andersen, making a big shift in the mid '90s when the firm got more involved in providing services to internal audit organizations, which '94 or '5 is when I made that switch. That ultimately then became a career. So I've had the good fortune of working with companies large and small, audit functions large and small, up and down the West Coast, some back in the Midwest. Obviously, a lot of one of the, as I would put it, the best thing and the worst thing that ever happened to the profession is SOX 404. So did a ton of work around that, and kind of stunned that we still continue to do a lot of work around that to this day. But had a great journey. Have had good fortune of working with a lot of good mentors. If you use the college football analogy, I'd say I'm part of the Bob Hirth coaching tree. I worked a lot for Bob back in the Arthur Andersen days, and he was very influential in the way that I think about audits, risk, value, and things like that. So it's great to be on with you.
Well, Bob's a great guy, and it's funny because it's football season right now, right? We're getting close to the Super Bowl as we're recording this. So,
right.
But yeah, that coaching tree, Bob has had a huge impact on the profession. I mean, in general, he left and went to Protiviti when we went to KPMG, but yeah, I mean, he's had a huge impact in the profession in general. So
Right. Very much so.
Interesting to use that coaching tree analogy. I love that.
Well, it was always fun to drop at KPMG when the like COSO 13 came out, and I'm like, oh yeah, I know the head guy in COSO, guys. So what do you want?
Yeah. You want me to get him on the phone? Kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. You got a question about that? I got a source.
Yeah. Well, no, and before we hit record, we were talking and kind of catching up, and especially in maybe this one, hopefully we'll have you back again, because you've just got a ton of experience and knowledge and thought leadership to share with people. But some of the things that we were talking about before that I kind of wanted to dial in a little bit is there seems to be this aspiration of what internal audit is supposed to look like, right? And so again, this can come out from thought leadership things, from technology firms. I mean, everybody's putting stuff out there about what internal audit is supposed to be, right? We've got standards, we've got all kinds of stuff, right? But I wanted to talk a little bit about that because like you said, internal audit looks a little different in different places. So maybe if we can kind of go through and talk about, because you've seen lots of clients, big, small, all over the place. What is it that really actually makes an internal audit shop great or add value in the organization?
Yeah, so you're right. And one of the things, I think, if you draw a comparison, right? So if I'm talking about external audit, it's everybody, the end product, exactly the same, financial statements, opinion, all the work that goes into it is plus or minus 5% of all the other firms. It's all kind of the same. And people kind of understand what it is. So when you make reference to the external auditors, you generally know what they're up to. But when it comes to internal audit, and again, most of our constituency base that we have out there, their main familiarity with the word audit is the external audit, not the internal audit. And so when you talk about internal audit, then that's kind of where their brain goes, or alternatively, it goes to, hey, I worked for 10 years at XYZ Co, and internal audit at XYZ Co is this kind of an audit function. And that's what they think it is, because the presumption is every audit function is the same, or at least directionally the same. But when you get into it, it is dramatically different from A to B to C. I mean, yes, internal audit is required for a New York Stock Exchange company, something. They don't say what, they just say you have to have it.
Well, you just have to have a person in charge of it, right? It doesn't even say you have to have a department. You've just got to have somebody responsible, right?
Somebody doing something, right? NASDAQ, no such requirement. And I don't know if you remember, but a couple of years ago, NASDAQ had proposed that they would put in a requirement for it. And companies were just screaming, no, we can't afford it, blah, 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 And they said, oh, by the way, we have SOX, so, as a surrogate for audit. And in fact, I talked to a number of companies, NASDAQ companies, that just said, well, isn't SOX internal audit? They just,
well, that's their experience. That's what they know.
Don't know. So there's this wide bandwidth out there. And despite that wide bandwidth, virtually all those companies probably have a charter, an internal audit charter, that says virtually the same thing. I can audit anything, anywhere, anytime. I've got the pipeline to the audit committee chair. I've got, all this kind of stuff. It's basically the same. And so, I think a good question for companies is to understand, fine, that's what your charter says. What's the real charter? What's the real charter, right? I mean, you go into a lot of these companies, and the classic one I find is, if okay, fine, I'm gonna go in and audit sales, the sales process or whatever it happens to be. Good luck with that. You can be 110% right in virtually everything that you're doing, and the pushback becomes, well, internal audit wants me to worry more about controls, so I'm going to miss my sales numbers, this quarter, and so then the CEO's like, oh God, we don't want that. It's a hard place. Not that you can't do it. There are good examples where people have done it, but by and large, it's a tough one. Tax is another one. It's just like, you'll go in there and it's really, you're really going to try to audit tax? Really? Again, you're asking for brain damage in that particular space. So I asked, what's the real charter? If you're saying you've got this risk-based audit plan, yet I look at your plan and it's all location based, and I'm going and I'm doing the same kind of audit program that every single one, that kind of thing, is it risk-based? Well, probably meets some definition of risk-based, right? Like
a risk-assessed a universe, but it's not
right,
linked to objectives or
right,
risks.
right, exactly. So I think there's just a wide variety on that, and to the extent that then all this thought leadership is out there, the firms are all a big purveyor of thought leadership. Anybody that makes a software product that potentially fits in this space has thought leadership on how you're going to do stuff and all that. And it gets hard because you, as an audit exec, I think you begin to think that, God, everybody's doing this and everybody's doing that, and we can't do this. And you sort of feel like you should. But the reality is, go data and analytics. I go to any shop right now and I ask them, are you doing data and analytics? Yes. You're going to get a yes. Every single one is going to give you a yes. Mm-hmm. But then you look at it and you're like, well, it kind of looks to me like you're doing what we did with ACL 20 years ago. So I'm not really sure that's what we really mean by data and analytics as an example. So point being, there's a lot of info out there. Maybe it's like, magazines that have, models that don't resemble any of us physically, right? And that they're creating an image of what we're all supposed to aspire to. But it's hard. It's a challenge. And I think you have to kind of understand what your real chart is, what your real permissions are in the company before you begin to think about where you can go.
Yeah, and I think that analogy that you just made with the magazines and the models, right? Or it's like the beer commercials. Everybody's trim, fit, and healthy, and 20-something drinking beer, right? Well, that's not been my experience. Most people I know that drink beer, right? They don't look like that. Yeah. But again, because you hear that so much, a lot of times people, they get down on themselves. They think, well, I'm not good enough. I have to be like someone else. And that ends up actually being pretty dangerous. I'm guessing you've seen that in your career too, but I've seen some, chief audit executives who are like, oh, well, the IIA says I'm supposed to do this, or the firm says I'm supposed to do this. So I'm going to force and drive my company to do this. And almost every time it ends in disaster for that person.
Agreed. There's a lot of people who ultimately become their own worst enemies, and not because of any sort of competency issue or anything like that. It's just, to me, it's a failure to understand how internal audit is aligned in the organization, right? External audit is a good point, right? Because I do, one of the things I did was I did a number of QARs for companies, and the most value you're going to get out of that is not just some sort of assurance that you're aligning with audit standards, but doing that 360 where you're talking to the constituency base of audit that's out there, including audit committee chair and all that kind of stuff. And when you do that, you can see real quickly. Not uncommon at all, right? So I've got an audit function that's like, yeah, we're adding value. We're putting people in the business. We're doing all this great stuff, and value added and all these things. Then you talk to the audit committee chair, and the audit committee chairman is just like, I just want them out there kicking in people's butt and controls, and I don't really care about all the rest of that stuff. And then you talk to, executives, and they're like, well, they need to, they kind of need to stay in their lane, but, and we want to support them, but, do they really have the skills to do, kind of all this new stuff? And one of the favorite things, and things I suggest to your listeners to ask, is that, so when you get to that question about internal audit as a management training ground, right? Everybody wants to say that. I learned over time the way that I can verify that is ask one simple question. It's like, who's the most famous alumni of internal audit in your organization? Just ask them that. And if they're like, well, Joe, so-and-so is an assistant controller somewhere. Okay, that's not adding a lot of talent. Whereas I've been to other places where it's like, well, these 3 VPs all did time in internal audit and da-da-da-da-da. So, it's like, it comes down, one of the big the biggest things that I've tried to put across to my team and my clients is just you've got to learn the fine art of intellectual honesty, because I think deep down inside, I think everybody knows. I think they do, because I mean you have to. And so if you just sort of like, okay, maybe we're not. I mean, again, internal audit in most CFOs, right? Because most of them administratively report to a CFO, right? It's maybe a little different, but that's the typical one. If you look at the CFO's cost centers that they have, the finance function, they may have the IT function, they may have all sorts of stuff reporting up to them. Internal audit is far and away the smallest cost center that they have, right? Mm-hmm. So, when you're in there, like, oh, I mean, it doesn't resonate, right? They've just got so many other things that are more important to them in the short run. So then you, as the audit function, I think just need to be patient. You need to be persistent, and talk to them about not just kind of, I mean, you got to be awesome with what you're delivering, right? You got to be. I mean, it's so brutal when you get in there and you're working with a company, and then they've got communications that are 3 to 6 months old or worse, for various reasons. A lot of times, not necessarily unreasonable reasons. But how does it make you look as the audit function? No one's going to blame the auditee; they're going to blame you. Mm-hmm. And so again, are you adding value when the information that you're talking about is 9 months to a year old? No, it's not value. Even if it's right. I mean, it's not value.
Well, and I want to go back to some of that aspiration stuff, because you brought up too about, internal audit is a training ground.
Right.
And there was GE was famous for that, right? Because they love to do that. What did they do a few months ago? Hey, new CFO in town. We're not going to do this anymore. So they stopped, right? So for a while it served management's purpose. Now it doesn't. Right. They've chosen to take a different route. And I think it's, but with this aspiration, because I want everybody who's listening to realize that if you're not, if you're not at the aspirational level, it doesn't mean you're not doing a good job, right? Because again, it's like, it's easy for all these thought leadership aspirational things. If you've got an audit staff of hundreds of people, you can do a lot of really cool shit. Okay. Mm-hmm. But if you're like most audit groups that have 5 to maybe 20 people, you're not going to be able to do these things. And it doesn't mean that you're a bad internal audit group either.
Couldn't agree more. Again, my informal working definition of what is a best practice in internal audit function. And again, it's funny that you mentioned GE. That has just been what we all just sort of default to for years,
ever
around that whole thing. And I'm not so sure it's really been true for the last 10, 15 years I don't know anybody from GE to verify that or not, but the best audit functions to me are the ones that best align with the company's expectations for audit. So as I mentioned to you before, I've had companies on both ends of the spectrum, very compliance oriented audit functions and very operationally oriented audit functions. And both of them, management loved what they were getting and wanted more of what they were getting. And I couldn't change the two. It just, I wouldn't look at one or the other. So that's what it really is. So to the extent that going back to that informal charter, okay, but if that aligns with management's expectations for how you're, because again, there may be other captive risk management activities going on in the organization, particularly the larger ones. They're going to have risk groups embedded in the business out there. So just because audit doesn't necessarily audit this particular activity through the audit committee governance chain doesn't mean that the company isn't somehow concerned about it or looking at it. They're just looking at it through a different lens. They're looking at it a different way with a different governance structure around it. So it just be aware, be intellectually honest, and to the extent, I mean, again, there's also some dynamics underneath, and in terms of the HR component of this that are changing. from what internal audit has historically had to deal with, and that may drive certain other changes that you have to make in the function. I guess what I mean by that is that a year ago, 2 years ago, we were talking about some work that we were doing, and we were going to be shifting some of the work from very SOXy kinds of stuff into more kind of real value-added internal auditing kind of stuff. And I'd been talking to the director and just saying, well, our people are probably going to love this, right? Because they're going to like this a lot better to do this kind of stuff. You learn a lot more. And actually, the director's like, you'd be surprised how many of our people just want to go lock themselves in a corner and test SOX controls.
Well, and that's an unintended consequence that happens a lot of times, because I noticed that with myself, right? Is I had when I was, kind of moving to more risk-based stuff, because again, at one of the companies, a lot of the expectation was around the compliancy kind of things. And some of the people that I inherited, that they were really good at that. I mean, you give them a compliance work program, man, they go lock themselves in the corner. They do their work. They're very good. They're very dedicated, but to ask them to start thinking differently in some of these risk-based or value-added things, they just couldn't do it, or they didn't want to do it. Right.
Yeah,
And so you have that personnel issue too.
I really think one of the best characteristics that you can have for an internal auditor, I mean, there's certainly a base level of technical competency that needs to be there, and increasingly that now that's also technology oriented. But really, from a soft skills perspective, it's somebody who's very comfortable dealing with ambiguity. Taking what is an amorphous thing and turning it into understanding the risk, developing an audit that's responsive to that risk, and then communicating back on how you think that's being managed. I mean, and increasingly, that's hard. It was, well, I guess I should say it this way. It never was necessarily easy to begin with, but I think some of us, particularly those of us that were diving in the early days, we didn't have a choice. They throw you into the deep end of the pool, and you have to figure out how to swim really quick. And today, there's just so much more infrastructure support, potentially tools and things like that, right? And so people don't want to do the whole, I'm giving you a blank sheet of paper, go figure it out. Now, that's what I think makes a really good auditor, somebody who can really deal with that kind of ambiguity.
Yeah. Well, and I guess just to, because I always like to kind of give some context or frame around things. So as we've been talking about kind of this aspirational thing, is again, if you think about, like, here in the US, we have the Fortune 500, right? The 500 biggest companies in the country. And they're the ones that get all the press. They're the ones that everybody knows about: Apple, Google, IBM, right? I mean, all these names that everybody knows about. And a lot of times people think, oh, well, we've got a company like Walmart that has, I don't know what they're to now, 1 million or 2 million employees. Oh my gosh, that's a huge company.
Yeah.
But we forget that there's tens of millions of other businesses here in the US that are not in the Fortune 500, right? In fact, a lot of the economy is driven by these other organizations. I mean, here in California, as an example, I can't even remember how many Fortune 500 companies we have headquartered here.
Right.
But we have a huge mid-level amount of organizations here. And so to kind of, translate this back to the aspirational, everybody hears about the big audit shops, the things like that. But I've kind of got a number in my head, but I'm just kind of curious from your experience too, how many audit shops of maybe 50 or 100 or more are out there compared to the number that have that 20 or less?
Oh, I mean, it's really, again, so you said Fortune 500. I'd probably call it more like Fortune 100.
Yeah, because you've got to get to about that level probably before you're going to have hundreds.
You got to get to a level of complexity, right? Which typically means billions in revenue, probably global in scope, probably definitely doing business in the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, things of that nature, before you're going to get people's attention that they're nervous enough that they maybe need to have an independent assurance activity that's going on in that space. Or alternatively, maybe if you, in certain regulatory scenarios, you may wind up maybe not being as big or having as big of a footprint. It's still having a relatively large audit team, just because that's the expectation of the regulator to cover everything. But Jason, exact numbers is brutal, because for example, I know a Fortune 100 that has not a team of 20, and that doesn't mean that they don't care about risk. It goes back to what I said about captive risk management activity. That's the way they choose to monitor, detect, and correct out there, as they have that doesn't necessarily roll up to the audit committee. So it's a small fraction. It's a small fraction.
Well, so that's why, again, if we go back to kind of what you brought up before, right? It would be silly for me as a middle-aged man to sit there and look at some professional athlete's body and go oh, I'm fat, I'm stupid, I'm whatever, because I don't have that 20-something professional athlete's body, right? It's very, very few in between. And so that person's idea of health and physique and fitness, and the fact that that person probably gets paid to work out 8 hours a day, right? I'm never going to have that same body, and it's okay, right? It's okay.
Exactly.
So everybody that's out there, right, that's thinking, oh, well, I'll never be like XYZ, maybe you should quit comparing yourself to everybody else and just focus on what I love that you said, right? The whether you are most closely aligned with management's expectations.
Yeah, exactly.
If you're doing what they're wanting you to do, if they're happy, we should be happy, right?
Yeah, but let me give a little bit of a caveat and a cautionary tale to that a little bit. One of the things that I see that I think people have to be very careful about. So this is more to your shop of 10 or less, right? And that is making sure that you're not giving the audit committee or the executives a false sense of comfort on something. Because I've seen, for example, right, I've seen it communicated this way to audit committees. Let's say I'm out and I've got a small audit team, and somehow or another I decide, hey, I'm going to go out and audit the shared services center that's out there, and then maybe processes, say, revenue transactions. So they go out and they do some work, maybe do a sample of 20, 25 transactions or something like that, and then they come out and they tell the audit committee that they audited $10 billion in revenue. It's like, no, you didn't.
You took a sample of the 10 billion in revenue.
Right. And so that's the hard part, because they're talking about, this one company I was working on, I was trying to unpack everything. It's like, you got a team of like 6, and you're telling me you've covered billions of dollars here and billions of dollars there. And then when you look at what was done, my God, the likelihood of something going sideways that you didn't touch on, pretty darn high. And so that's making sure that you're not somehow, or alternatively, okay, here's a bad one too. If you're going out and you're doing work, and I've seen plenty of auditors, they go out and maybe the audit program is 100%. You got enough time to do 80% of that work, right? And somehow you cut it short. You don't do the other 20%, but then you issue the audit communication around that. False sense of comfort. Then what happens when somebody can wait? Our warranty reserve was all messed up. Didn't you guys look at that? Oh no, we didn't have time. Right. So yeah. I'm a big believer in, despite that, in the communication. Don't say what you didn't do. Say what you did do, and just make sure it's there. Just so the smaller audit groups, because I think it goes back to what we're talking about. You've got all this information out there. Be big, be value added, be comprehensive, be all you can be, right? But then somehow you don't have the bandwidth, you don't have the depth, you maybe don't have the IT skill set, whatever it happens to be, fine. Don't issue a report that could potentially be misconstrued into what you covered versus what you did.
Yeah, because again, there's the when we're small, we like to puff ourselves up or make people think that we're doing more than we're doing to prove our value. But like you said, that other term that you came up that I heard you say, intellectual honesty.
Right.
That's what we're talking about here too, right? Is it's like, if you don't have or you can't do some of these other things, again, it doesn't mean that you're wrong, that you're bad, that you're whatever, but just be honest about what you did or did not do and not try to give that false sense of assurance. Because that'll come back to bite you in the butt quicker than anything.
Precisely. And then we've seen it. And frankly, I mean, I've experienced it with some of my teams over the years, right? Where all of a sudden you thought something was done and then you get into it and you're like, oh, great. We didn't really wrestle that one to the ground, did we? And so it's tough. Just, again, be honest. That's the best part.
Yeah. Well, and it's, I mean, this has been great. It's, I want to dig into so much more, and obviously we can't make these 3 hours. Some people actually have 3-hour podcasts. Can you imagine sitting and listening to the same thing for 3 hours? But
it's like you've got ways to go to become Joe Rogan. Okay.
I know. Well, I know. I don't have my joint over here either, right? So anyway, all right. But no, I mean, this has been great, George, because I think, again, it's because I would love to have you back in the future, because there's lots more where we can go to on this too. But especially as we were talking and to make sure that people understand, like you said, right? There's these aspirations out there. There's the charter. There's what's written on the piece of paper, but then there's the real charter. There's really what you do. There's really the authority that you have, right? It's the same thing. I keep bad-mouthing independence and objectivity, not because they're a bad thing, but because people think they're independent and they think they're objective, and they're not, right? Because objectivity is skewed based on cognitive biases, subconscious. We don't mean to do it, but we're not as objective as we think we are. And almost nobody, I mean, again, we go back to this very, very small group of chief audit executives who are truly independent. The way the charter, the way the standards, try to put that aspiration out there, because at the end of the day, I don't know many CAEs who don't have to ask for time off, who don't have their admin, reporting responsibilities, the person who gives them their salary and their bonus, right?
Yeah.
And so, we're not as independent as we think we are.
Yeah.
But, if we want to add value, how's the best way to do that? I think it's what you said, most closely aligned with what management actually wants.
Yeah.
That's
and
going to
the
be
key there, by the
providing
way,
them value, right?
Yeah, you used the word. The key there is being objective. That's what you have to do, particularly in 2020, where companies are going through unprecedented stress. Okay, maybe the best way to use audit is in some fashion that maybe doesn't align exactly with your audit plan. Don't hide behind independence as a reason not to do that. I mean, it's you got to help the org somehow, and you can manage all these things. I mean, they're manageable, but just be willing to take a chance. I mean, one thing I've done a number of times here. You notice I've tried not to use the word report, and instead use the word communication. Because communication is what the standards say, but people just box themselves in because they've got this whole report thing with ratings and grades and it just it's like getting a holding penalty on 1st and 10. Now it's 1st and 20, just because we have to do it that way. So to me, it's like it's a communication, guys. There is standards allow for a great deal of flexibility in what you communicate and how you communicate it. So don't be afraid to do something different. I mean, heck, even if you issue your reports in landscape, do it in portrait, because people who look at them will wait, something's different here.
Well, and I think because that brings up the point, that we were kind of talking about before we even got started was, both of us have been around long enough to have
Yeah,
seen, and it ain't that much different than what we were seeing 30 or
not
40 years ago, right? Because again, you take something like the audit report, and we have, in general, it seems like a lot of people believe that the product of internal audit is a report. And
hmm
so that is the product I deliver. That's the value that I provide to the organization. In fact, when my kids were little, they asked me, "Dad, what do you do?" Right? And so again, naively and trying to make it so a 5-year-old can understand it, I said, "Well, I kind of write reports and I write books, for people, right?" But again, that was the wrong way of thinking about it too. Is it's like we're not delivering a report as a product, we're helping the organization be more successful, be more
yeah,
likely to achieve their objectives, reduce those risks that stand in the way of meeting those objectives, or help them with the compliance issues that could be a big kick in the butt if you get $1 billion fine to an organization if
right,
you're breaking the
right,
law, right? And
right.
if we kind of shift it and change it around, and again, hopefully, we've been talking about this for a lot of years. People still aren't getting it, but I hope they will.
Yeah, it's just all about. All of among us, I'm sure, have had this experience, right? Like you go out, you do your audit. I'm probably looking at data 3 to 6 months old as I do the audit. And then classic auditor rolls onto another audit. They don't finish that audit and da 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 da. Takes forever to write the report. And these. So bottom line, ultimately, you issue this report, whatever, 6 to 9 months later, and everything, with data that's up to a year old, and it goes up to the top executives of the company. And then somebody reads this, and it's like, I thought we dealt with that problem. They because they
Yeah, we did.
expected
We dealt with it 9 months ago, right?
yeah, they expect it to be more real time, and then we're a historical reporting activity, and I think people just have, again, goes back to being intellectually honest. Is this really adding value? Yes or no? And I think there's ways to combat that. I mean, if you do get into one of those circumstances where you're way after the fact, um, okay, maybe what I should do is hit pause on issuing that particular communication, go out, confirm that it's been fixed, or do something else while I'm there, and then sort of do something that's more current in addition to the backdrop that's all there. And then people, oh, okay, it becomes a good story, and people begin to see some benefit to the activity as opposed to, yeah, I took my lashes 6 months ago and now I'm taking them again for the same thing. So
Well, because we all like to be punished twice for the same sin, right?
well, and by the way, the other thing I think people should keep taking consideration, right? So, you know, we do this quote unquote risk-based selection, right? And I go out and I'm doing things, and maybe I've got whatever, a controller or some sort of a manager as an owner of that particular audit. And you do well. The reality is, have we ever thought about, from the perspective of that specific person, how high on the radar screen is what I'm auditing? Right? I mean, they may have a half dozen things that they're involved in that are strategically more important than what it is I'm auditing. So, okay, you should think, why is that? Do I have that alignment issue that I should worry about? But at the same time, get some appreciation as to why you're not getting the time and attention that you need, right? And then if somebody's banging on that guy, you need to respond to internal audit. It's like, well, pick your poison, right? I got this
Yeah.
new system that's going live in 2 weeks, and I've got so there's just a lot of dynamic around the classic way internal audit approaches life that I think quite frankly, I think we're our own worst enemies in how we do things often.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that because it's and that's why if people just actually start asking some more questions. So
Yeah,
I love like the question that so learn from some of the questions that we've been asking here and start asking some of these yourself, right? Like
right.
the internal audit training. Okay, well, who's your most popular alumni?
Right.
We don't have one. Well, then maybe you really don't have that, right?
Exactly.
If management is kind of ignoring you and they're not getting back to you on the audit that you're performing, well, what are their priorities? And if we're not auditing or helping them with their priorities, if we're doing some little thing, right? It's like that idea of like, hey, everybody, we found $100,000 over here. And the manager's like, I don't give a shit. I've got a $50 million issue over here I'm dealing with, right? It's like, I don't
Exactly.
care about the 1,000. So, if you're getting ignored like that, then again, maybe some of those questions need to be, well, what are their highest priorities? And if we're not auditing or somehow aligned with that, then we're probably not adding the value. That gets back to your thing. The best audit groups are the ones that are most closely aligned with
Yeah.
management expectations.
It's amazing to me, Jason, how many times you might go around and you're doing, your classic risk assessment, kinds of conversations and things like that, and doing whatever, and people are like, oh yeah, we need to worry about X, Y, or Z. I mean, I this true circumstance. I'm going around talking to a bunch of finance people, and they're pointing the finger, like, I think the risk is over here, and I think the risk is over there, right? 4 doors down, intercompany accounts are out of balance, $4 billion. It's like, guys, And by the way, if you want auditing intercompany,
Oh yeah.
if you've got the patience and the sort of the expertise to sort of get into that, you will learn more about the company. You will touch on all kinds of potential value-added issues, but it will also be the biggest rat's nest that you've ever tried to get through.
Yeah.
So.
I hear you. Well, George, thank you. Like I said, I mean, this has been great, and I know it's going to be really valuable for everybody who listens, because you've seen it, you've been there, you've seen the good, the bad, the big, and the small, and really have a good perspective on helping, again, the majority of the people. I mean, probably 90% of the audit shops out there are never going to meet the aspirational things that are put out there, because you can't. You don't have the resources. You can't. So quit trying to compare yourself, right? And just try to align closely with adding value to the organization, which is by meeting management expectations, right?
Yep, exactly. I mean, it's all okay. Just you certainly. I mean, again, if you are going to ask for more resource, well, make sure you're educating people as to what you're going to do with it. Just like anything else, right? So if you've got, it's a horrible analogy, but I'll use it anyway. It's like, so if you're a government, and you're going to want to put in a new tax, right? And you're going to the voters for a tax. You pretty much got to educate people what you're going to do with the resources or the money, or what kind of a problem you're going to tackle with it, right? Yep. But then if you go internal audit and go, well, yeah, I need 2 more headcount. What are you going to do with it? Probably need to be able to articulate the whole thing, right? And get there. So, no, Jason, it's been awesome to talk to you, and I'm happy to chat anytime. Just read out. Right now, I have plenty of time on my hands. So.
I know, as you're transitioning into retirement, quasi whatever you're going to do in this next phase of your life, I appreciate you taking the time with me today, though.
No worries. I'm happy to chat anytime.
Thanks. And that's a wrap. Thanks for listening to today's episode of Jamming with Jason. Keep on rocking in the audit world, and if you enjoyed this episode, please share with your friends and leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. Connect with me on LinkedIn and let me know what you enjoyed the most about the podcast, and you may even be featured on a future episode. When you're ready to turbocharge your leadership development, join the Briefing Leadership Program, where you get access to everything in one place and can interact directly with me in the group. If you'd like to earn continuing professional education for listening to today's episode, head on over to C-Risk Academy's video on-demand learning platform at ondemand.criskacademy.com. Not only do you get a CPE certificate, but you will also have access to hundreds of video on-demand learning opportunities. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are that of the individuals and not of their respective organizations.